Imagine going back to the 1950s. South Korea had just come out of a devastating war. Its cities were badly damaged. Millions of people were poor. The country had very few natural resources. South Africa looked very different. It had gold, diamonds, coal, a large mining industry, and one of the most developed economies on the African continent. So here is the strange question. How did South Korea eventually become far richer per person than South Africa? Today, South Korea is home to companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. Its cars, phones, ships, and electronics are sold around the world. In 2024, South Korea's GDP per person was about $36,200. South Africa's was about $6,300. That's a huge difference. But this isn't a story about one country being smarter than the other, and it isn't simply a story about natural resources. The real story is much more complicated, because South Korea didn't become wealthy overnight. It made a series of decisions that slowly changed its economy, and South Africa was following a very different path. To understand why, we have to go back to the beginning. In the early 1960s, South Korea faced a massive challenge. It needed growth, it needed jobs, and it needed foreign currency. So the government made a bold decision. South Korea would sell to the world. Instead of focusing mainly on producing goods for its own people, South Korea increasingly focused on exports. Factories began producing textiles, clothing, electronics, ships, and eventually cars. The government supported industries it believed could compete internationally. It invested heavily in infrastructure, roads, ports, electricity, and education. The strategy was not perfect. The government was authoritarian during much of this period. Workers faced difficult conditions, and South Korea experienced serious political tensions. But economically, something remarkable was happening. The country was learning how to manufacture, then manufacture better, then manufacture more advanced products. The World Bank describes the 1960s as a period when South Korea shifted toward export-led industrial growth, with rapid increases in trade and industrial production. And this created something incredibly important: experience. The country wasn't just selling products, it was learning how to make them. But while South Korea was building factories, South Africa was dealing with a very different problem, and that problem would shape its economy for decades. South Africa had something South Korea desperately wanted: natural resources. Gold had transformed the South African economy. Mining created wealth. It helped build railways, it supported industries, and it helped make South Africa one of the most industrialized economies in Africa. But there was a major problem. Who was that economy being built for? Under apartheid, South Africa created a system of racial segregation and political exclusion. The majority of the population was denied equal political rights, and economic opportunity was deeply unequal. Education was unequal. Where people could live was controlled. Where many people could work was restricted. This wasn't simply a social problem. It was also an economic problem. A country cannot fully use its human potential when millions of people are denied equal opportunities to develop their skills. While South Korea was trying to build a highly educated industrial workforce, South Africa was operating under a system that deliberately restricted the opportunities available to much of its population. And there was another difference. South Korea was becoming increasingly focused on manufacturing for global markets. South Africa remained heavily connected to mining and resource extraction, even though it also developed substantial manufacturing and services. So the two countries were building different economic machines. One was increasingly focused on make it, improve it, export it. The other remained strongly connected to dig it, process it, sell it. But resources weren't South Africa's only problem, because history was about to make the gap even harder to close. By the 1970s and 1980s, South Korea's industrial strategy was becoming more ambitious. The country moved into heavier industries: steel, ships, cars, machinery, chemicals, and eventually advanced electronics. This was risky, but it created companies capable of competing globally. South Korea was moving up the manufacturing ladder. It wasn't satisfied with selling cheap products. It wanted to make more valuable ones. South Africa also had major industrial capabilities, but apartheid increasingly isolated the country internationally. Political conflict intensified. International pressure and sanctions increased. Investment became more difficult, and the economy faced growing structural problems. Then came 1994. Apartheid ended. South Africa became a democracy. This was one of the most important political moments in modern African history. The country now had the opportunity to build a much more inclusive economy, and enormous progress followed in many areas. But economic transformation proved much harder. Because ending apartheid could change the political system overnight, it could not erase decades of inequality overnight. The country still faced enormous gaps in education, wealth, employment, housing, and infrastructure, and those problems continued into the new democratic era. Today, South Africa remains a major and diversified economy. It has mining, manufacturing, finance, tourism, agriculture, and some of Africa's largest companies. But growth has remained too slow to create enough jobs. The World Bank says South Africa's economy has grown by only about 0.7% per year over the past decade, with unemployment remaining above 30% in 2025. So the question becomes even more interesting. If South Africa has so much potential, why hasn't it grown faster? The answer isn't one thing. There's no magic formula. South Korea had advantages, South Africa had advantages, and both countries made mistakes. South Korea benefited from strong export growth. It built manufacturing capacity, it invested heavily in education and infrastructure, and it developed companies that could compete globally. South Africa had a powerful mining sector. It developed sophisticated financial markets. It built major industrial capabilities, but its history created enormous inequality. Apartheid damaged human development and restricted economic participation for the majority. Later, slow growth, infrastructure problems, weak investment, and other structural challenges made it harder to create enough jobs. And here's something important. South Korea's success wasn't simply because it had good leaders. Its development also depended on the global economy. Foreign markets mattered, foreign investment mattered, technology mattered, geopolitics mattered, and South Korea received significant international support during its development. So this isn't a simple story of South Korea worked hard, South Africa didn't. That explanation is far too easy. The real lesson is that countries become wealthy through a combination of history, institutions, education, infrastructure, investment, trade, political choices, and sometimes luck. And here's where the story gets interesting. South Africa's story isn't finished. The country still has enormous advantages. It has a large industrial base. It has sophisticated banks and financial institutions. It has universities, it has major ports, it has mineral resources, and it remains one of Africa's most important economies. But potential is not the same thing as performance. A country can have gold underground, but that gold doesn't automatically create jobs. A country can have talented young people, but talent needs education and opportunity. A country can have factories, but factories need reliable electricity, transport, investment, and access to markets. That may be the biggest lesson from comparing South Korea and South Africa. Resources can create wealth, but people, institutions, technology, and productive industries determine how widely that wealth spreads. South Korea's transformation wasn't caused by one miracle. It was the result of decades of building factories, building infrastructure, building skills, building companies, and constantly trying to move into higher value industries. South Africa has many of the ingredients too. The question is whether it can turn those ingredients into faster and more inclusive growth, because this isn't really a story about South Korea, and it isn't only a story about South Africa. It's a story about development itself. Two countries, two histories, two very different paths, and one important lesson. Being rich in resources is not the same as being rich in people. So what do you think? If South Africa had followed a development strategy more similar to South Korea's after the 1960s, would it be a much richer country today? Or were the two countries simply too different for that path to work? Let me know what you think in the comments, and subscribe to Africa Explained for more documentaries exploring the questions that shape Africa and the world.